Today we have with us Saba, a documentary filmmaker whose works have focused on issues of gender, sexuality, communalism and culture. Sabaji's first book, Tawaif-Nama, has emerged from her trilogy of films on stigmatized women performers. The first in the trilogy, Delhi, Mumbai, Delhi, was about the lives of bar dancers. The second one, Naach, was focused on women dancers in rural fairs. And the third, The Other Song, was about the art and lifestyle of the Tawaifs. Sabaji will be in conversation with Mugdha Sinha. Mugdha ji is a civil servant of 2 decades and a poet. She also does art, doodles meditative mandalas, and paints bottles. As the literary secretary of the IS Association Rajasthan, she regularly curates book author conversations and has a huge personal library as well. Her poems have been previously published in Sahitya Academy's Journal on Indian Literature and in Femina by its poetry editor, late Kamla Das. She has also been an International Executive Program Fellow at the Goldman School of Public Policy, University of California at Berkeley. Before I hand over to Sabaji and Mugdha, I would like to thank our presenting sponsors, Shree Cement, for their continued support, and our partners, ITC Rajputana, Spargia, and Ehsas, women of Jaipur, without whom this series would not have been possible. I request you all to please put your phones on silent. Sabaji, Mugdha, over to you.
So thank you really for the kind words and a very warm welcome to Sabaji and to our lovely audience today in Jaipur. So we have an hour for conversations and hope we can make it fruitful. Would you like to say something to the audience? As in just a hi?
Thank you for having me over, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation today here with Mugdha and with all of you. So let's get going.
So before we launch into our question, I just thought that we should first compliment Saba for a very, very well-researched and balanced. I say balanced because she developed a friendship with the main protagonist of the novel, and she's been able to do justice to her friendship by only revealing that much which was required to be revealed, I guess, and has also been able to be critical of things that she probably thought would be necessary in the book. So balanced and very, very nuanced. So when you read the book, and it's a huge 600 pages of very gracefully and deftly crafted, which I'm sure also brings her sensibilities from the other audiovisual media that she's worked in as a filmmaker and a documentarian, as she likes to call herself. Also, what I found interesting in the book is that the way the book has been curated, it's a piece of art to possess, apart from the reading. So also many compliments to everybody who has woven this beautiful piece of art, which is a chronicle of the times and tradition of the lives, how they negotiated with the times and how they redefined their roles, how from the epitome of being part of elite mehfils of, yes, Rajputs, their patrons, basically. I thought Jaipur would be interested the moment I dropped this word Rajput. So from being there to how they got marginalized, and even more painful is the fact that more than getting marginalized, they also became somewhere down the line indecent and obscene and deviant, which is what is very painful, and it has been brought out very well. So many, many compliments to you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Before we actually get into the book, a little peep into who Saba is, not just as a person, but pre her writing. From a documentarian to a filmmaker, how did you traverse your 3 decades of being in that calling, I would say, and what motivated you from filmmaking to do something like this? And I believe since your last movie, The Other Song, which was mentioned here, came out in 2009, and this book has come out in 2019. So this book has been in the making, almost carrying this child for good 10 years, a decade. So why don't you tell us, how was your approach in writing this book, and how was your research different from your other media that you have worked in?
Actually, it wasn't very different. I have been a documentary filmmaker for the better part of my life, and most of my work is very research based. So there is a lot of research that goes into almost a lot of my films. The other song, which is on the wives, looking at the wives, their art and lifestyle, and the reasons why they and their art and lifestyle got stigmatized. That was based on research which was both field-based as also archival research. The book actually came out of that because in a film we have a defined frame. We can't overload a frame. And there was just that. There's a lot of research that I had done, which couldn't find place within the film. And so it was, friends and well-wishers, they all said, you must write, because it would be a waste and it would be very sad that this research just goes to waste. So, because the other song itself had taken a very long process into making. I mean, it is not a very easy subject to work on, simply because no one wanted to be identified as Tawaras to begin with. So that was my biggest hurdle in any case. So that's how I ended up, without really realizing what I was getting myself in for, saying yes, I do a book. And then I got this New India Foundation fellowship, supported the writing. But after that, actually, it was a long haul, because the research that I did have, I realized soon enough was just not enough. It just meant more work. But the process was not new to me. It was a process that I was familiar with. And so it was my training as a filmmaker, really, which saw me through in the writing. And as filmmakers, we write. I mean, it's not that we don't write. We write our films. So I was writing, but yes, of course, I've never written a book. This was my first attempt at it. But I approached it very much like I would doing a film. It didn't feel very much different, really. We have these long periods of being on our own, very lonely, long stretches of working. This was longer and lonelier stretches still, that's about it. But yeah.
Okay, so you have over the last 15 years developed a kind of a friendship with the main protagonist, whom you've chosen not to mention by name in the book. I'm interested in knowing, and I'm sure the audience is also interested in knowing, how did you decide to make her the protagonist? What did you choose her, or did she choose you? Is there some episode or some conversation, something that you would like to share with all of us, which is not part of the book? I mean, some trigger that said, okay, I'm going to make her the centerpiece, because your book is pretty layered. So if you look at it from one perspective, from the reader's point of view, you will see that it's a 3.5-hour journey between Bhabua in Bihar and Benares, right? And that you have stretched to about 100 years in terms of chronology, beginning right from 1857 to almost the very current contemporary times, where you mentioned things about how bicycles are being given in Patna as part of a government program, and things like that. So it is, it traces 100 years of a small space, which is only 3.5 hours journey, and it also goes back in times 4 generations of an entire Tawai family. And you have not failed in touching upon anecdotes from the very concentric circle of Tawaias emerging from little stories that you have. So how did this friend of yours become the centerpiece? Because there's so many other people who could have been the centerpiece. Why her?
I mean, certain times I think it is, destiny chooses for everyone. I was destined probably to meet her. Maybe not. I mean, I was working very, and as I said, uh, my initial research for the film, that was for the film really. I had been traveling, I in fact did a lot of research even in Jaipur. I visited Jaipur in the initial phase, which is in 2002, 2003. I was here. I spent quite a bit of time in Jaipur and traveled with it, to some of the Tikanas and with some kind friends who worked. So it's just that I found myself, and I traveled to Lucknow, to Banaras. I was working in Delhi, which is my own home city. It is in Banaras really that I started feeling that there was a story unfolding. I mean, that could be said, that could hold true for all these other places actually, because they all had a very old tradition of music and dance, and also of tawafs. Banaras was a center of Purabang Gaiki, of Kathak, both of which were closely associated and nurtured and presented by tawafs. So if we talk of Purabang Gaiki today, we should remember that this is a Gaiki that has come to us courtesy the Tawaf musicians. So I was interested in, and Banaras also represented a certain kind of a high culture, from UP and Bihar, with a very vast hinterland of Bihar, eastern UP, over which it was presiding. I met a lot of families in Banaras. Many of them initially were not interested in either talking to me, but that happened even in Jaipur. In Jaipur also a lot of doors would be shut on me and I'd be spending a lot of my time having lassi here on the streets. But so in Banaras too, it was initial phase went in just trying to convince people to talk to me. But it was understandable, why would they want to identify themselves from a Tawaf background, given the stigma, given the shame, given the kind of ostracism that they have faced on account of their background. And I'm an unknown filmmaker, so there's no reason. Over a period of time, actually, I was able to talk to people. She was one of the very first people who decided to trust me. Now, I think that has to do with individual kind of thing. Why would one woman trust another woman? So it's like just a chemistry meeting. We got along from the very first meeting, I remember. And what is not there in the book is that is my own, the fact that I also didn't know very much. That was in fact, my first visit to the home of a former Tawaf. Thus far, I'd been meeting them in other, musicians' places or their former patrons' homes, etc. And I remember I had a feeling of nervousness when I was going. I went alone to meet her. There's this thing, oh God, I don't know what it'll be like, and that reflected that even I, for all the research that I had done, somewhere also it had got into my mind about being associated with sex work or some kind of undefined criminality. It was another matter that when I went to that house, this the kind of, as the book is there, the kind of respectability that she holds dear to herself. I think it was just that. I mean, we got along, and over a period of time, I realized that she had a family that could trace its roots back to 150 years, to early 19th century. Now, someone who, such a family with such a long, undivided history, unbroken history, that was fascinating for me. And I also developed friendships with a lot of her women relatives who were still living, who were much older than her, who carried memories. So the more I heard their stories, I mean, when I was first working, spending time, it was not with the idea of a book. This was while I was also doing my film, I was talking to them. But then over a period of time, I realized that actually the story of this family and the story of other families. See, I must say, I would like to add one thing, which I have written even in the book, in the introduction, is that because the protagonist was so keen that her identity not be revealed, I had to change everyone's names. Not only the family's names, I had to change the names of their accomplice musicians, of the wider social circle. So I also got, in the early days, I used to be, I used to wonder how am I going to write this. It was a big challenge to have to write the social history of a family which is very much there. The protagonist is alive. To be true to that, writing, and yet to actually protect identity. How would I do this? But once I started writing, I realized that it gave me the leeway to bring in other stories. So yes, it started off with the story of this one family, but I added several other stories, so they became, some of the characters are like composite characters. They've been taken from other Tawai's too, whom I met along the way.
Yes, so it's actually, that's what I was trying to tell you, that it's a multi-layered thing. So it's not just the story of a Tawai family, and it's just not a chronicle of the Tawai's in general. But she has nuanced it with a whole lot of very well-researched stuff on the music of the times, how it evolved, the politics of forming associations when the Tawai's fell into disrepute and how they redefined their roles. There's a whole lot of stuff about dance, a whole lot of stuff about how how men and women were treated differently, and there's a whole lot of gratitude that the protagonist has, because in some ways I feel that by writing this book, you might have given them allowed them to reclaim the lost space and a little bit of the voice on which the entire Tawai tradition was beholden. So that I think you've been able to do very successfully in your book. Interestingly, when I saw the size of the book, I was wondering, and I saw the name, I thought something controversial in it. But interestingly, you got me hooked from the first chapter itself for the simple reason that it opens out beautifully and it intrigues you into reading this entire volume, as I'm sure it will once you lay your hands on it. Because she opens with a wonderful comparison, which I've rarely seen in places. So she compares a family portrait of the Tawaif, the protagonist's family, the extended family, where she only sees women in the portrait, in the picture, in the family picture. There are no men, the men are missing. So Saba, as a writer, finds it intriguing, so she asks the protagonist, so how come there are no men? So that lady, the protagonist, answers that in a Tawai household, this is very normal, right? And then she compares it with her own family portrait, where she had seen 3 rows of unsmiling men and no women. Okay, and when she had asked somebody in her maternal lineage, your aunt, she had said that in those times women could never think about getting themselves photographed with men. Coming from the bureaucratic circles, even today, so that is how contemporary, and I would like you to say something about your own experience of this, this contrast that you have, with which you have begun the book. Because even today, 20 years in the service, with so much that has changed around us, I don't know whether you also feel there are a lot of women in the audience today. I'm sure during the question and answer session, you can also share your own perspective, ask her about it. Today when I enter a dinner party in the bureaucratic circles, automatically, I don't know, by something, the women all lean towards one side and the men. And I sometimes don't even know the women because they're mostly the wives of male officers whom I have more recognition. So Saba, your whole book is full of this conflict, this contrast, this paradox. Why don't you share with us how you feel in contemporary times, because you're not just a writer and a filmmaker, you are also somewhere a feminist, and you don't find it, you're not shy of saying that you are a feminist, and also an activist with your campaign that you started in 2017.
Well, for me, what was very important when I was writing the book is where do I place myself in the book? The story of the Tawaifs cannot be told because just to write their story, I realized I was implicated in their story, as are all of us. The fact is that if the research into the Tawaifs showed me one thing, that the entire movement to remove them from public spaces, to stigmatize them as being deviant, immoral, of their art form being obscene. This is around late 19th century. Late 19th century, interestingly, is also the time period for women's reforms, for educational reforms for women in Parda. And I think many of us who come from those families owe it to those reformers, and they were all male reformers, who fought for the rights of women to access public space, to step out of Parda, access public space, go to schools, colleges, ultimately be part of, even much later over the generations, be part of the workforce. And it became very obvious to me that in a certain sense what was happening was that the same reformers were also at the forefront of demonizing these women, who were actually the only sections of Indian women at that time who were educated, accomplished, precisely the same accomplishments that they wanted for respectable women. Being educated, being accomplished. But these women had to be removed so that good women like us or our grandmothers are not confused with Tawaifs, because of the stigma around their sexuality, the fact that they didn't marry, then they had these relationships outside of marriage with patrons. So I felt that somewhere I cannot write this in without acknowledging the fact that the place I am in today, that I am in a place to be able to write her thing. It puts me in a certain position of power. But that position of power only has come by actually negating the kind of positions of power or autonomy that this community of women have had traditionally enjoyed. I had to acknowledge it. And that is something that runs through the book. I don't think that they, the relationship between me and I come from a family, from my father's side, a family where there were Tawaifs. Tawaifs would be called on occasion. So it's not as if I had not heard of those stories. They were hush-hush stories which girls like us were not supposed to hear, लेकिन अपने कान लगा के सुन लेते थे. So the thing is that, so I mean, this nothing very exceptional. I mean, it's very much a family, lived in Havelis, and then there was this entire, movement where girls, my aunts, etc., made that movement out. It was a big thing to be able to step out of Parda, to go to attend school, and then even to attend college, etc. So that was a history that I wanted to acknowledge, and also acknowledge with all humility. And and what the writing of this book for me was an exercise in reclaiming the histories of women. I did not do it because I was trying to improve their status, because I don't think a book alone can do that. In all humility, I don't think books or even films can do that. What we can do best is to raise questions, perhaps to open up a certain discourse, where at least today we are sitting so many of us and we are openly talking about Tawaifs. Otherwise, for very long it's been one of those hush-hush things where no one was very clear. Ki Tawaif hoti kya hai, and it becomes synonymous with sex workers. So my relationship with the protagonist, in fact with her entire family, is one of deep friendship, where over a period of time, I feel privileged. The gratitude, if at all, is from my side, that I have been accepted. And I feel privileged that I have been allowed, they've reposed that much trust in me to allow me to tell their story. And also to allow me to tell their story with the words. It's not. I also knew one thing, that I didn't want a story, a romanticized account of Tawafs. Everything is wonderful because no, lives are complicated, relationships are messy. There are power dynamics which drive relationships, and really, if we have to understand any community or any a family, at family level or at a community level, we have to understand all those power dynamics. And I feel grateful that they trusted me enough for me to write about all that. And yet, our friendship has retained, That is, for me, what is really important.
So it speaks both ways, I think, as far as I've read. But I would say that apart from the story part of it, I think it's also one of the very, very fine pieces of writing of subaltern history. Because this is for the first time, at least I have come across a book which is speaking from the point of view of the Tawaifs themselves, their story, their voice. So that makes a very, very good reading. And somewhere I think the message that you want to convey is that while Tawaifs may be individually flawed, and you've also picked out certain things that you found in your own protagonist, her attitude towards her daughter-in-law and stuff like that. See, it's a whole lot of paradox, but as a collective, they are not flawed beings, is what you're trying to probably convey through your book, which is very nice. The other thing that somewhere in your book you mentioned, one of your, your cast in the book says that describes very beautifully what it is being a Tawaif. You say it's almost like float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. So while they might have got exploited in their own professions where sex was akin to skill, okay, and they had other skills. They were skilled into art, they were skilled into poetry, they had access to education, they would read the newspaper to carry on a conversation. So Saba, tell us two things. One is that there are other books on similar kind of issues, and also about a whole lot of stuff about the geisha tradition in Japan for some of us who might have read. Because when you describe the geishas, it's also an Eastern kind of a part of history, culture. They say that it is the fine art of hosting, where carrying conversation, being companions, because the wives are supposed to be docile and they are not supposed to be. So tell us, do you also find some parallels between the Tawaifs and their tradition in being relatively, as you mentioned, autonomous, independent economically and emotionally? Because exploitation existed in the Tawaif circle, but then if you contrast it, you find that your own protagonist is able to raise her voice against domestic violence against her own daughter when Amjad, the husband, beats her up. So while they might have got molested in the process, might have entered into unwanted sexual relationship as part of their jobs, but when it comes to being mothers, they also pick up cudgels against something like small things like domestic violence. So they are very humane people. So tell us something about the geisha tradition and parallels. That is my one question. The other is, I also want you to educate us, because you've done so much of research, on this whole paraphernalia of the Tawaif tradition, the riyaz, the muzra, the dress that they wear, which is akin to the armor of a soldier. So they are battle ready for what may be thrown at them, and also the thumri, datra, the kathak. So just these two things, then you will probably also place the whole, the culture of the Tawaifs for all of us.
See, I am no expert in the geisha tradition. Whatever I can talk about is just based on some readings that I did, because I wanted to have a sense, a cross-cultural sense of other cultures, and the geishas are the closest approximate. So there are many parallels. Parallels being that in terms of the long and rigorous training, both that geishas and the apprentice Tawaifs had to go through, and that was in many fields. So the training, there was a long and rigorous training of music and dance. And geishas were not primarily musicians and dancers. They were companions, they were hostesses, but they also performed. They also did perform on musical instruments. The primary role of the tawaif was as a musician and dancer, and also being companion to men, being lovers to men. So their training, and it was a long, arduous training for both. Also very rooted and very tradition based. So, which I found interesting, because in the Tawaif tradition, for instance, there is a way which is part of actually, in Hindustani music, that is the same kind of talim that even male ustads impart to their shagirs, which is based on the Guru Shishya Parampara, which is based on reciprocal sense of duties and responsibilities. And Tawaifs also pretty much shared the same kind of relationship with their teachers. With the geishas too, from whatever I have read, there was that period of training. There was also the other sense being women of substance. Tawaifs were women who were often the elite tawaifs. See, we must not forget that tawaifs formed a hierarchical community like all communities were. So there were very rich tawaifs, and there were not so rich tawaifs. But the elite tawaifs of any city were amongst the most affluent women of that city, because they had independent incomes. They did not, whatever they had, most of the women in, from respectable families, what their incomes came from through their husbands or through their fathers. They did not hold independent incomes. Tawaif community also had their customary laws treated men and women equal in terms of property, for instance, inheritance related laws. Tawaifs were the only section of Indian women till about the mid 19th century who had the freedom to adopt children on their own. Hindu and Muslim married women, Hindu women could not adopt at all. Muslim women could not adopt at all. Hindu women could do so, but only in the name of their husband. So, if they were widows, then in the name of their husband. But Tawaifs actually had that freedom, and they did adopt. The differences between geishas and Tawaifs were quite a few. I mean, the fact is that geishas, from what I have read, I've been able to glean, it was not as if this was restricted to certain castes and communities. It was not identified with certain castes and communities. It seems that actually girls from poor families, either they were sold into it or they found their way into it. Whereas, contrary to popular misconceptions, Tawaifs were a closed community with a sense of boundaries. So either there were these certain castes and communities which formed the wider community. Either you were born within that community or you were not. Even if those women, who might not belong to the community, but who took singing and dancing up, let's say, but they would never be recognized as Tawaifs from within the community or from within the musicians' community. So there were similarities and there were differences between the two cultures. I think the most important difference was that the geisha culture, it died out. There are no geishas now. There are no Tawaifs now also, for that matter. But geishas did not die out. There was no sustained morality drives hounding them, and stigmatizing them. But in the case of the Tawaifs and Devdasis, they fell victims to these morality drives. That is the main reason. First by the colonial rulers, and then by the nationalists. So they actually that's the major difference.
Yeah, I think we should ask you, since you also mentioned it, because with changing times, especially after the 1857, suddenly when the governance of India shifted from the East India Company to the Crown, I think this whole concept of British morality, driven with a sense of motivated bias and prejudice, seeped into the Indian times, and with a lot of the handiwork of a lot of laws and legislation, I think it impacted the place of the wives in the public sphere. So they were driven out of traditional places like temples and even elite places like their own homes and mehfils, and patronage also changed, because we are sitting in Jaipur, and I must touch that little episode about Kajli Teej, and you can also speak a little more about it, and also tell us how this whole colonial mindset impacted the Tawaiffs. That is the question. So the Kajli Teej that we celebrate here in Rajasthan, we all thought, and even Saba writes that she also thought that it was associated only with, it was a women's festival. But it was not actually, and the Tawaiffs and the non-Tawaiffs both celebrated it. In fact, even the fact that the sindoor, which married Hindu women put, was earlier put by married women, both in Hindu and Muslim community.
In Tawaif families.
In Tawaif families. So that was how progressive the Tawaifs were. In fact, somewhere I feel that they were more progressive than women of our times. And Saba, I think you can take us all down to the trajectory of times and the British approach, which is what really impacted the independence and the autonomy of the Tawaifs.
See, Tawaifs as a community, there were Hindu castes and Muslim castes and communities that formed the entire community. And it's one of the most, amongst there are many appealing aspects of the culture, is its deep syncretism. So there's this ways in which there are, like you said, about the daughters-in-law, even in Muslim Tawaif families, wearing the sindoor, for instance. There are many cultural practices like this which are now eroding within even Tawaif families, but which spoke of deep syncretism. As far as colonial, the impact of colonialism on the Tawaif culture, the point is that even by there's a certain kind of a morality, a certain Victorian morality, within which they could not actually, the Tawaif, you see, any woman in fact, who was outside of marriage and in sexual relationship, within that framework became synonymous with the prostitute. So there were so many communities of women, not just the Tawaifs, but there were the Jogans, there were the Devdasis, there's a large community of women across India who had, arrangements, family arrangements which were outside of marriage. So, but within British law, they all became, bracketed as prostitutes, and their way of life began to be defined as prostitution. And I think that was the beginning, the point where actually the stigma started. That started even before 1857, even when the company rule was on. You have these references. By the early 19th century itself, there were increasingly hostile laws coming into place, which were increasingly passing hostile observations, if not criminalizing Tawaifs per se, but making hostile observations about their customs. So, for instance, the custom of adopting children. So, the laws came into place, saying that actually girls, the Tawaifs prey upon the domestic felicity of our families, and they take away our children and make them prostitutes, which is simply rubbish, because it's a very difficult time. land revenue policies being what they were, poverty-stricken parents were desperately selling themselves and their children. So I mean that's a different story altogether. Post 1857, actually, once India comes directly under Crown rule, there was it was also a self-serving reason of casting Indians as being not being fit to govern themselves. They uniformly there is a certain ways in which Indians, especially Indian rulers, are demonized routinely as decadent, as like effete, and steeped in all kinds of decadent pleasures. Now, all of that decadence somehow seemed to get personified in the figure of the Tawar. So this is, and what really, if you read colonial accounts, what is seen as inherent proof of Indian deviancy is, the open presence of prostitutes in public spaces on public occasions. Because Tawars, elite Tawars, were very much part of celebrations in elite homes. So they would be there. They would be performing even on religious occasions, although they did not play a religious role like the Devdasis did, but they would perform even in the major temples in Banaras. All the major temples during Navratras had performances by Tawars. So now those were upheld. So there's a law making that came into being. One of the ways was that, post 1857, you had all the personal laws came under Muslim law, Hindu law, these personal laws. Tawars were put under those laws. Now those are patriarchal laws. So Tawars and Devdasis and other communities, they customarily had been following their own customary laws, which gave importance to women, treated women equal to men. Under patriarchal Hindu law, Muslim law, for instance, as far as their inheritance is concerned, their right to inheritance, they suffered. Suddenly, men became the main, the property became, started going in the name of men. So there was all of that that took place. Simultaneously, the CP, the criminal, there's a criminalizing of Tawars themselves, and so of all the the related activities of the Tawars. So that process unfortunately went on for a long period of time when Tawars got acted with prostitutes. So that law making of whatever was for prostitution was for Tawars too.
But can we only blame the British sense of Victorian morality, as you rightly say? Or do you also think that the same thing got carried away in the whole nationalistic fervor when the Arya Samajis came into the picture, and especially when a lot of people, even somebody as revered as Mahatma Gandhi, saying that women, the Tawars have to sell their chastity because of the lust of men, and they are worse than thieves because of the thieves of virtue. So things like that, and we are sitting in the sesquicentennial year of Mahatma Gandhi, and it piques me to find that a lot of contradictory stuff has been said. You are a feminist. I would expect something that you have mentioned in the book about how even nationalism mirrored the same kind of thought process that the Britishers had. So we were not any better. In fact, we made things worse off.
You see, we were in such a hurry because our nationalist leaders were, after all, schooled in British schools, and they were product of a colonial education, and so they took and in many of the biases of the colonial masters. And even though we were, the nationalism was, against colonial rule, we internalized a lot of their morality. And we were in such a hurry to, and so we internalized that Tawars were prostitutes, Tawars were a blot on the face of Indian culture. And And we were in such a hurry to say that actually they did not really belong to our culture. They were outsiders. So the kind of the actual ways in which Tawaiffs suffered was unfortunately at the hands of the nationalists. They suffered at the hands of the laws, colonial laws, but they suffered much more ultimately at the hands of the good nationalists. And because from the early phase of the late 19th century, from the RS Samadhis to even the other Hindu nationalists who were talking in terms of a great Aryan and pure culture, वहाँ पे भी Tawaiffs जो थे, they were a blot. They were projected as coming as a later addition into Indian culture. Later on, Gandhi did not talk about of them being a blot. He did not, actually, to give him credit. Neither did he say that they were external to Indian culture and thing. But whereas the early nationalists, the early Hindu nationalists saw them as these vampires, literally. I mean, that is how they are projected. They are these they destroying families, etc. Gandhi saw them as victims, who had needed to be rehabilitated. So now Gandhi is a complicated person because yes, there's much when Gandhi talks about Tawaiffs, which makes me very, very uneasy. But the fact equally is, and let's not forget that it is Gandhi who made the participation of women in such large numbers in the national movement possible. It's actually in the non-cooperation movement that women come out in the largest numbers on the streets, not just students, young women students, as was during 1905, but actually housewives. I mean, so he made that the presence of women in public space and their staking a claim as actors in the national movement. He made that possible. So we owe Gandhi that. So, he is not an easy person to understand. He had many contradictory views about women. He said women's role should be in terms of being being the queen of the house and marriage. But he also said the greatest role a woman can aspire to is to be the sannyasin of India and remain unmarried. Now those two things don't really make sense. But this is Gandhi for you. And he's saying that. And the thing is that also I think with Gandhi there is constantly a man who is constantly thinking and evolving. He's not static. And I think that's the credit I give him. This constant revision of his own thought process.
Very fine art of balancing. I was trying to push you to a more radical point of view and feminist, but good, you kept the ground. So,
no, I do actually. I genuinely believe that there is much of Gandhi which, as a feminist, a feminist history owes to him also.
So you talk about Sita, your maternal aunt, who is
my maternal
grandmother. Sorry. So she is coming out from her private space, getting educated, the first in the family to get educated, and moving out from private veiled society to public space. And it is exactly that point in time when the Tawaiffs are receding from the public space that they had to private and maybe from the page to the margin of society. So that is very interesting. At the same time, so the feeling that I get is that while we want to appropriate their art and tradition and music, and you somewhere also mentioned that in the 1940s with the advent of Lata Mangeshkar and Bhosle, the craft got elevated, and that was the end of the Tawaiffs because it got appropriated by the middle class, is what also you mentioned somewhere. So there's full of paradoxical thing. But the question that I want to ask you in very, very contemporary times, since we are all sitting in Rajasthan, where we had for a very long time what you call female infanticide. So when I was reading your book, I thought that the Tawaiffs at that point in time, some 200 years back, made for perfect brand ambassadors for Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao.
Absolutely.
I read this and I thought, oh my God, and how did we absolutely discredit them and demonize them, because they were such good examples. And local historians have also said that if the prince did not go to the tawaifs, he would not become a polished man. So they were like a finishing school for teaching tamiz and lehzeeb, and look how where we are in contemporary times. So do you think, Saba, that technology, the advent, we've spoken about colonial attitudes, we've also spoken how those got mirrored by the nationalists, the early nationalists. Gandhi had a contradictory kind of a stand, difficult to assess. But what about technology? The advent of the gramophone, the recording, the radio, the theatre, the film, cinema, because you have huge number of people from the industry who had courtesan backgrounds, and you mentioned in your book, we know of Nargis, who came from a courtesan background. We have others like her, like Kumkun and Padma, who didn't become so famous, but also came from courtesan background. In fact, the first lady who acted in Alamara, Zubeda, was also the daughter of Fatima Begum, who was a courtesan herself. Then Padma Shri Begum Akhtar, whom we so gloriously listen and so proud of her, actually had her ancestry in the whole Tawaif culture. So tell us, what do you think about technology? Because I very strongly feel that technology marginalized them very, very greatly.
See, this is technology proved to be a double-edged sword. The fact is that the advent of entertainment technologies, so it's or also large-scale entertainment, be it say the Parsi theatre, which was the predecessor to the coming of cinema, then the gramophone, and then of course cinema itself. If you see, actually, all of these medias have been enriched, and their history is intrinsically linked to Tawaif performers. The first well-known artist to perform for the gramophone was a Tawaif, Goharjan. So, and in fact, in the first decade of the 20th century, which is when gramophone was, its early stages, the male ustads and the male musicians, they were very hesitant to record for the gramophone, because for two reasons. A, they felt that there was an exclusivity, which is in singing to private elite audiences. So they would lose that tag would be lost, that music would be available to all. Just about every musician would be able to copy their musical style, etc. So that fear, insecurity was there. Secondly, there generally a fear that jisko bhaupu kehte the the horn, that sucks out the soul of the singer. It was actually a very strongly felt belief. Tawaifs were very brave creatures. They did not suffer from any such, fears. So they were in the largest numbers, the earliest recordings. In fact, till about 1920, it was the Tawaifs who were the largest number. Tawaifs along with Devdasis in the south, who account for the largest number of voices for the gramophone. Similarly, if we were to look at Parsi theatre, where did the actors come from? The early Parsi theatre had mostly all male casts, but later theatre did have female roles. They all came from courtesan or related backgrounds. Early cinema, the earliest cinema, which was silent cinema, well, mostly they came from Jewish backgrounds, from Anglo-Indian backgrounds, from certain other performing backgrounds. But as soon as there was the advent of the talkies meant that you need to know the language. So, the fluency in Hindi, Urdu, and also music, who could sing. It was the Tawaifs who, in fact, across as actresses, then later even as playback singers, they dominated the film industry, and they gave the film industry a lot. Cinema today owes a lot. It's from Meena Kumari to Nargis to Nimmi, you name them. They all came from courtesan backgrounds, and I say so with the greatest respect. It's another thing that we've never given them that due. We've never given that community that recognition and due. But I think what also happened that along the line, by the about 1960s, the participation of Tawaifs in cinema, for instance, started waning. That were many reasons related to that, and the book deals with that. But I think what technology did was that there were so many other mediums of entertainment which were now being made available. कि भाई आप गाना सुनने क्यों जाएंगे? I mean आपके पास ऑप्शन है, आप जाके सिनेमा भी देख सकते हैं, आप जाके थिएटर भी देख सकते हैं. तो those are the ways in which definitely leisure, the ways in which leisure was defined, leisure related practices did change, and therefore culturally, there were changes that came in. The problem came that simultaneously, this was also the period that Tawaifs were being demonized. So actually, had there been no demonization, these very, this maybe phase of life, feudalism itself was on the decline. They would have moved on, and this in terms of as musicians, as dancers, evolved. We don't know in what trajectory that would have gone, but that never did happen. Even in terms of, when I talk about appropriation, I was talking appropriation really in the field of classical music. I mean, so Thumri Dadra, Ghazal. I mean, these were the domains of the Tawaifs. What have we done? We are very proud of Thumri Dadra Ghazal, but we have thrown away the Tawaif artist from it. And we've also cleaned out all references in there, which could have pointed to them. तो मतलब ठुमरी के ही बोल जो है, बहुत सारी बंदिशें जो है, those have been changed to make them suitably, to sanitize them, to make them suitably respectable. So the newer singers, the middle class singers who now sing Thumri Dadra, they take great pains to actually say, अरे हमें तवाइफों की तरह मत ट्रीट कीजिए. अरे भाई आप गा तो रही हैं उनका. The point is that the least that can be done is to acknowledge that this is the music which belonged to that community. It was they who actually nurtured it, preserved it, and brought it to us today in the form it is. And instead of actually acknowledging that, we've not only pushed them out of those music, we've also contributed in the process of further demonizing them.
So that's true, because a lot of the contribution which the Tawaifs made, actually, it's like saying that we want your art, but we don't want you, kind of a thing. So you will stay on the margin, but his art is what we are going to appropriate. So even early on in the book, if you look at the Gadar movement or 1857 First War of Independence or whatever, so Kunwar Singh becomes a nationalist. He fights against the British. He is one of the patrons. He's a Rajput patron of Dhamman Bai, who's a Tawaif. And she does a lot to help him sustain that very prolonged kind of a fight that the cudgels that he takes against the Britishers. While Kunwar ji has a stamp, post-independence in his name, he has a college named after him, but there is University, yes, sorry, I stand University in Ara. But this lady who actually ensured that he survived it all does not even have a footnote mention. And this is not just true of your book, madam. This is also true of another book called My Name is Gohar Jan, the lessons that you made, written by Mr. Sampath, where he also says that all references to how she was so honest in paying up her hospital bills, everything has got erased from history. So we have kind of erased the Tawaifs from our memories. And as you very rightly said that, so there is a point, and this has a contemporary reference, because we were reading news that a particular very eminent professor of repute was asked by another eminent university to submit her CV. This has been circulating in the news, and I could only refer back to one of the episodes in your novel, which says that when all these institutions started coming, the music schools which wanted the art and not the Tawaifs, so when the Tawaifs also wanted to redefine and get rehabilitated, because Gandhiji saw them as a victim and wanted to rehabilitate them, So they started asking them for degrees. So one of the characters in your this thing says that if a man is a hoarder, if he's a thief,
Murderer.
he is even a murderer, he will become a board of trustee. But a lady who has been singing for decades and upholding this tradition of music and dance is being asked for a degree and is considered as dirt. So as a policy maker, somewhere I feel that when we are making a policy asking for degrees and stuff from traditional holders of knowledge, so my question to you, Saba, is that you have been a writer, filmmaker. Tell us also something. Do you also do policy advocacy? Because you've done so much of, you have such a body of work. You are an activist somewhere in the fact that you've written, you've held campaigns. Do you also now think of making a switch to doing policy advocacy for the Tawaifs now that you've given them certain voice? Do you think that will be a natural progression in terms of how you'd like to take it forward? Any thoughts on that?
You know, this, as a documentary filmmaker, we've been involved indirectly in the process of policy advocacy. I mean, it's not that we haven't been, because a lot of, say, the work that I have done has been used by women's groups as part of their campaigns and also in terms of their advocacy with various government organizations, other organizations, to push certain issues forward. And that, so through my work, definitely, indirectly I've been part of that process. As far as the book is concerned, whether, you know, I never planned even this book, or I just wrote the book. I just wrote it because it was there and someone had to write it. I think I wrote it. In terms of policy advocacy for them, I think the best that I can do is what I am doing now. You know, speaking up about them, encouraging people to ask questions, and to approach the entire culture again with an open mind. That is something that I can do, and I am doing. So, in terms of, you know, I think certainly the Department of Art and Culture, for instance, उनको पता है, they don't really need me to tell them how to open their doors. Those doors were deliberately shut down to Tawaifs from the inception, and it was not like some oversight. It was a very deliberate policy through which, for instance, All India Radio owed its commercial success to its music. Most of the music, almost all the female musicians of All India Radio from 1930 onwards were from Tawaif background. When the interim government was formed in 1946, one of the first orders that Sardar Patel gave, because he was Minister of Home, also of Information and Broadcasting, was that artists whose private lives were a public scandal be not allowed to sing for the radio, because it brought a bad name to independent India. Overnight, Tawaifs were removed from behind the radio microphones. So, and if they had to go back to those microphones, they had to either get married or get Fachi certificates and marriage certificates. And overnight, you have all the bais changing and turning their names to bais to begums and devis. So you have, the Sudan bai is defiant about it, but Siddheshwari becomes Siddheshwari Devi, Akhtari becomes Begum Akhtar. So those transitions take place, and they take place under duress also. So it's a certain ways in which all the Sangeet Natak Academy, etc. They should have opened their doors to these musicians, and even the older musicians should be actually, some amount of pension should be given to them, for instance, because many of them are in really bad circumstances financially. The younger ones who have a musical training, there should be an additional help given to them to be able to get jobs as music teachers if they want to teach music, because they are equipped to do that. But so those are things which, I think that those are very obvious. They don't need an outsider like me. Those are built, those biases and prejudice have been built into policies. So I'm hopeful that actually all this questioning and the way it is in the media now and these questions are being asked. Let's hope.
So before we throw the session open to the audience, I think I'll just leave you with bits of provocative stuff so that if you'd like to ask something from the book to Saba. So there are a few things in the book that are very interesting in terms of how there is a reverse discrimination happening in the Tawayaf households with the men, which is very different from the patriarchal setup that we live in. So the men there are escorts, they are accompanists, they are not people who are earning family members. So the breadwinner is the lady, and at most times they say that to have a tawayaf is a good son. Okay, so things like that. Very interesting, the turn of phrases that you've used actually make you think. There are places that you cry reading about how Asgari was raped by a musician, by a teacher, and how the mother did away with the teacher. So while, when you think that, okay, in case the rape can happen, the molestation, so it should be easy, but they are also there, what you call the professional ethics, even in a profession like this. So a lot of stuff like this, and I'll be happy to have the audience ask Saba, and I would like to thank Saba for such a detailed, nuanced, and a beautifully written book, which I'm sure will make everybody just pick up and read, and maybe it is very, very thought-provoking at really several levels. Empathetic, I would say, teary, it makes you teary-eyed at times, and there's a lot of suspense. So it is a beautiful craft. It doesn't look like it's your first book. So there will be a lot of expectations from you if you ever do plan to write your next, because I like the surprises when when in conversations between the wives, when the story rolls out, you suddenly find why Asgari was so arrogant and what was the childhood trauma associated with her life, and then you suddenly judge her deliberately. So there is a little kind of intrigue, there's a little kind of a suspense in all of the little stories that you have. So thank you very much, Saba.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure talking to you.
A friend of mine wrote a nice article called Swatantra History about Ganikas. And he said that Ganikas are the only independent women, because otherwise in the society all women are dominated either by the father, the husband, or the son.
Yes.
But Ganikas, because now you also pointed out of independent income, that was very important. Now look at the famous Ganika. The most famous is Amrapali, where Gautam also goes. And she donates a large amount of money for the Buddhist monastery. So he writes that Ganikas were the only social history.
They were. They definitely were. They were taxpayers too. And Ganikas, of Gupta period, Mauryan and Gupta period, it is the tradition comes down to the Tawaips. And this is quite fascinating how actually the castes and communities that formed Ganikas, although then it's about Gupta period we know more, about Mauryan period we know less. We have references, and it's it is so much of that same tradition that comes down and then takes on the shape. The term Tawayaf came into being only by the late 18th century. It's first used then, it comes in use much later. So, but certainly they were women of substance and autonomous, relatively autonomous women. See, Swatantra connotes ki there is within, we have to remember one thing, that India, this was an intensely patriarchal society. And the Tawaids were not some rebels, or they were not outside patriarchy. They were adjuncts to patriarchy, they were also serving patriarchy. They were serving a certain need of patriarchy. The wives were not educated enough to be companions of the men. So you had to have this other class of women who were outside of Parda and who could act as companions. And who are also, of course, skilled musicians and dancers. So, but within that space, within patriarchy, they were also dependent on men. Ultimately, they were dependent on their patrons. What was that, the income that was, the independent income they had? That income was actually coming from their patrons. So, ultimately, they were dependent on their patrons. And that is something that in the book also, it was very important for me to not just write a celebratory tone. No, we are right, there is a certain context, a certain historical, social context within cultures are there, exist. But even within that, relative autonomy, I'd say. The freedom for for the Parda women, there was very limited freedom. And I enjoyed definitely far greater autonomy. Definitely. I mean, they were and that I see the remains of that even now in households belonging to Tawai backgrounds, although there are no longer any practicing Tawais anymore, which is that women are the main decision makers of the family, and it's always the older women who are the decision makers. What is also very interesting, that since they do have a certain tradition of women's education, in a lot of Tawai families, especially the elite Tawai families, girls are educated. So they are, because it's not something new. It's something which is part of a certain tradition that comes to them, which is very different from, say, so-called respectable households where the push has to be for. Those unfortunately, men in the families, in Tawai families, yes, because they were not bread earners, they played no economic role within Tawai families. So their status was very much akin to what is the status of daughters in patriarchal families. The sons almost had the same status. When a girl was born in Tawai families, there used to be celebrations. When a boy was born, it was short of matam, it was mourning. We did worse, kill the girls off. So that it's like a reverse mirror image. Also, the families see there's not all the women in Tawai families enjoyed equal freedom, as I pointed out. Women who were earmarked to be Tawais, they enjoyed that freedom. Then when they became Tawais, they were earning, they were the main decision makers. But there were women in the family who were seen to not have that kind of talent to become Tawais. They were married off. Now those girls who were earmarked to be married off, they certainly enjoyed no such freedom. They were kept in Parda. That's a very interesting fact about Tawai cultures that very few people actually know, that Parda existed within Tawai families. The Parda was for those girls, daughters who were earmarked for marriage, or for daughters-in-law who were already there. Daughters-in-law in Tawai families did not enjoy any rights. They had the same lack of rights as in patriarchal families. So that space is not, but it's liberated space for the women who were Tawais. But in many other ways it mirrored also many of the dynamics of patriarchal families.
Saba, you've given us a very detailed peek into the lives of the wives and their rise and fall in fact. What I'm interested to find out is, they suddenly disappeared after independence. What's happened to them? And I'm sure they would need rehabilitation wherever they are. Since I'm an activist too, I would like to know where are they in society? Where do they exist now?
You see, what happened was that post-independence, um, over a period of time, say through the 1950s, this first came the Suppression of Immoral Traffic Act. Now that the act was actually aimed for, was geared towards sex workers, but also hit the towers. Because in its implementation, as far as the police and the administration did not make much difference between the wives and prostitutes. So the wives were routinely harassed and victimized, and arrested. So that itself played a major role. So in any case, the wives were a dying tradition even by 1947 because of sustained nationalist morality drives against them. Post 47, things became even worse for the wives because even the spaces like All India Radio shut their doors to them. The new, the independent Indian state did not open its cultural, did not open the doors of art and culture to them. Now, fact is that in most areas, in places like Delhi or in even Jaipur or Lucknow, the wives continued under increasingly difficult circumstances. But I think by about the late 1960s, 1970s is when really most of the Tawar shut shop, shut kotna moved away. What happened to them is not uniform. In some of the Tawar families, the elite Tawar families, for instance, they just moved away, which is so their daughters, their daughters got married. It's actually sometimes very difficult to say this is the Tawar family because they have taken real care to erase all the markers. But the sad thing there is that actually what has happened is that even music and dance, they've erased that. So I mean, one of the saddest things is like my friend, the protagonist, I keep telling her that, after you, jo bandish ho janti hai, will die. All that virasat will be finished. She has to teach someone. Now the music schools won't have her, because she would have taught that music to her students, and she will not teach her grandchildren, because that stigma is there. So that I think is very sad. As far as in the poorer Tawar families, there are many families send their girls to become bar dancers. So bar dancers, bar dancers come from all over India and from all kinds of circumstances, but also from Tawar families. So they went in all kinds of directions actually.
But who would marry a girl from a Dewan family? Who said they get married when they
From within the community, their own boys would. See, they had sons. The sons needed wives, no?
Right.
So, and it was a very close-knit community. So, wherever the wives for the sons of the wife's family came, they would come from daughters in the community who were earmarked for marriage, who were either deemed they had no skills for music or dance, or maybe were not considered pretty enough. So, for whatever reasons, or in certain, it's very interesting, and that is the thing that I was told very many times. They said, it was a choice. So I said, what choice could an 11, 12-year-old girl make about whether she would be a Tawar or not? Interestingly, actually, somebody, the protagonist of this book herself, she fought with her family to be allowed to become a Tawar. Because her sister didn't want her to be. Her sister wanted her to be married. And she felt that this was, the protagonist of the book, she felt discriminated against. She felt that, and it was a form of discrimination. It is very interesting. So what was told to me is that एक तबीयत होनी चाहिए. Tabiyat means a temperament. So either the girls had to have that temperament, a certain fearlessness, personality to be Tawars, or they could not be Tawars. So for many reasons, there were girls in all Tawaf families who did not become Tawafs, who were married off within the community itself.
But were the boys educated? They had a job? What was the economic condition like?
Well, now of course the things are changing and boys are the main, in many of the families, boys are the main bread earners. So boys are being educated. But in the earlier Tawaf families, they simply did nothing. So, they were neglected children. It's like girls in patriarchal families who were just neglected. वैसे ही थे वो. So and they're just dependent on their female relatives, so, their mothers or their sisters or their aunts who were Tawafs. Within the Tawaf community, for instance, Baap Bhai is a synonym for being a parasitical life. So they say Baap Bhai. It means it's a parasite.
So they have assimilated in the society now. They don't need any rehabilitation.
And I don't know about rehabilitation. They don't really need any rehabilitation. They needed help, financial help. So, like I said, here are families who are at a cost, at a price. They have, when we say about being assimilated, what do we mean by that? They've paid a huge price for that kind of assimilation. By assimilation, we mean by being accepted by society. Sure, but that is by completely erasing their own being, their sense of being, the kind of culture, their traditions, everything. So वो तो है, the Tawaf families have assimilated in that sense. The protagonist of the book herself, on the surface of it, she is very much a very respectable woman, but she's lost everything. She's lost her music, she's lost everything in the process, and that's a big loss that we are talking about. So I don't think there's a rehabilitation that we are really talking about. I think what I'm talking really about is a certain recognition, even if it is late, of their contribution to music and dance, to Kathak, to Thumri Dagra Ghazal, to recognize that, to honor that. I mean, they don't need to be rehabilitated, we need to be rehabilitated in our attitudes.
Ma'am, 1739, मोहम्मद शाह रंगीला नादिर शाह उस पीरियड से पहले की कोई हिस्ट्रीज कहीं मिल सकती हो जो हम पढ़ सकते हो इंग्लिश ट्रांसलेशंस because there's very few books that I've come across which are pre-1739. You get to know the society and the culture.
1739 से पहले की जो है वो फॉर इंस्टेंस जो यूरोपियन ट्रैवलर्स थे मनुची फलसात अब आप उनके जो अकाउंट्स हैं वो अवेलेबल हैं वो पढ़े जा सकते हैं मतलब फॉर अकबर्स रेन जहांगीर then
local culture जैसे अवध ये जो आपके local histories if Manuchi was
when he was a traveler and he was so there are these also Manuchi writes a lot at the time of Shah Jahan. You get a sense of the imperial court and the kind of roads that they were not referred to as Tawars. Tawars comes in much later, in the late 18th century. And it is in Dargah Quli Shah, in his book Barakah-e-Dilli. He first refers to as Tawars. So, pehla reference to Tawar. Lekin yeah, I mean these are communities of women whom they say Domni hai, Lagni hai. So various communities of women who were dancers. So there are accounts. Akbari has accounts also of the communities. As far as what you are talking about, look, in terms of Banaras.
जैसे राजस्थान में, if I were to know, I'm deeply interested in what the society was like in the 17th century or early. There are hardly any books जो first-hand accounts देते हैं उसके बारे में, unfortunately.
the accounts for the arts in India, see, the history writing itself in India is, I think we are more happy as a society in writing mythology or in believing in mythology than in writing history. और उसमें जो है the problem further is compounded that the history writing about the arts, music especially, actually all arts, is very fragmentary. It's like you literally, when I was also researching, I was literally piecing out from little bits and pieces that I was finding at places and trying to find a whole. My work, of course, begins from what would from early 19th century, which is a post-colonial, the post-colonial period, so that is the work that I was working on and relied on. But actually, the history of music and musicians in India is really very, very fragmentary. And उसपे से the history of Tawais, it's really very paltry. So it's not as if there are all these accounts waiting to be discovered. You'll have to just do archival work and look for those particular accounts if you are interested in that particular period.
So can I just say something here? There is this City Palace Museum which has a Pothi Khana. So I'm not very sure though, but that is one good place to begin seeing, because a lot of stuff has come out of it, like pictures, paintings drawn by the Thomas and William brothers, which is exhibited in Redford, which I happened to go and see, by Guidance Wilson. He actually curated the whole thing. That was lying locked in Pothi Khana. So I'm sure if you're really interested, I mean, the little that I know. And one other piece of information that I can share with you is that there is this great institute in Tong district, which is the Persian, the Arabic Persian Institute, Research Institute, which very few people go. But there's a whole lot of stuff which is all covered during the time that you are looking for, in and around that time. It's all in Persian and Arabic, but worth a look. Really beautiful. And there's one institute in Jaipur called RORI, which is the Rajasthan Oriental Research Institute. Again, a fantabulous place to be, with things like Kaak Shakunbali and all that, how the crowing of the crow actually, from which direction and from which distance, can actually tell you what it implies, whether it's good tidings or bad tidings, and they have a diagram and stuff like that. So much stuff like that, you can spend hours looking at it. So maybe you should try those. And those are government. So I was interested in telling you that हम लोग ने थोड़ा reserve.
No, I can talk about Banaras, in the history of Banaras. So for instance, a lot of my research happened in Bharat Kala Bhavan, which is part of Banaras Hindu University. We have to search. I mean, it was also a lucky break that we found people at Bharat Kala Bhavan who were happy to help and take out material. But this I'm talking, of course, of the 19th century, because that is my period of study, and I was really looking at a very specific region and locating histories within that. But I am sure that the state archives are there. Depends on which area you want to work on. Then you have to start looking at the state archives, for instance. We worked in the National Archive, and there's a lot of material that we were building up. A lot of on the law itself, actually, most of the work was done at the National Archive. I was working at the Dewan Memorial Library. Because in the, for instance, the entire history of the morality drives, especially in the non-cooperation movement and later, all those have been carved out, and that because it's not that there's a history written, one had to find it, and it was all the contemporary newspapers of that time. Just one had to, and that's why it took so many years. Exactly, just painstakingly reading the contemporary papers of those years in the microfile section and just seeing what the tags were. And any reference to Tawaif, just noting them down. It's just it's not as if there are documents waiting to be found. These are these fragments. We have to start reading against putting them together.
Ma'am, you have a question.
Last question.
Thank you for the lovely session. And I would just like, as you said it in the beginning, that you made some nice documentaries on it. So which one is one of your the documentary which refers to these books and to the stories which you refer to us to see?
See, I don't know about nice book films. I hope they are nice. But I have done amongst the work that I have done, there's a series that was referred to, which is some of my later works on female performers. So the other song is the book on Tawaifs, which is the film on Tawaifs, which I finished in 2009. And it's from there actually, after that I started working on this book. So yeah, I mean that film is there and be happy to share it if you'd like to see it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you so much for an interesting session and Muktaji for holding the conversation together. Can we please have a big round of applause? I will now request Mr. Sudhir Kastiwal to present the mementos to Samaji and Muktaji.